we have some good background material on how soils behave, on their stiffness, their damping, and the volume change characteristics. And those are all going to affect the way they behave under low levels of loading and under strong levels of loading. We often break our problems of geotechnical earthquake engineering into two main categories. One is those of response problems, where the soil will respond dynamically during an earthquake, but at the end of the earthquake, it ends up pretty much in the same place it started. The other component are ground failure problems, where the ground ends up either displaced by some horizontal distance or by some vertical distance if it settles following earthquake shaking. So we're going to be dealing now with ground response issues. How do the local soil conditions affect the nature of ground shaking? How do they affect the amplitude of the ground motions, the frequency content of the ground motions, and their durations? So, as we said before, we have source effects, path effects, and site effects. And the source effects are those that exist at the source of the earthquake, where the rock ruptures with some pattern, and waves travel out as the energy is released in all directions. And so source effects that we're concerned about include the hypocenter or nucleation point, where it's located, the point where the rupture first begins. We're interested in the pattern with which the rupture proceeds as it moves away from that nucleation point. We're concerned about the distribution of asperities, that is, strong spots on the fault, where more energy is going to be released relative to other portions of the fault. And we're interested in how much movement is going to occur and how it's distributed over the surface of the fault. Here's a slip distribution for the Landers earthquake. Professor Gray talked about this earlier with respect to its effect on ground motions relative to the direction the wave rupture was progressing. We can see that they are not uniform over the rupture area of that fault. Some of this energy that radiates away from the source is going to travel to our site. It's not going to take us a uniform straight path like that because the Earth's crust is not uniform. And when waves hit different materials or the same material that has perhaps locally different properties, it's going to be refracted to different directions due to the changes in stiffness of the materials. And as it's refracted, waves are going to be reflected and sent off in different directions. And we refer to this as scattering, and scattering will reduce the amplitude of the motions as well as the geometric spreading and the material damping. So the scattering is another factor, and it affects high frequency, low wavelength, short wavelength components of a motion more than lower frequency components. So there's wave scattering, there's the material damping or anelastic attenuation, and there's geometric spreading that are all going to influence the nature of the ground motions. It moves along this path from the source to the site that we're interested in. And when they get to the site, some of that motion is going to be propagated up to the ground surface. And the manner in which that happens is going to be affected by the local conditions. And so in the Northridge earthquake, some energy that was released at some depth made its way towards the city of Santa Monica, located kind of the south and west. And due to the softer nature of the material, it was refracted to a more and more vertical path. And when it hit the rock layers below Santa Monica, the waves were refracted. Well, those rock layers are offset by faulting, and the Santa Monica Basin has a shape that caused wave energy to be distributed in complicated ways. So there was focusing of the energy at certain locations, and in between there were areas where the waves were refracted away from that zone. If these waves had come along a different path, say from the south, we would have seen a much different pattern of waves and pattern of refraction occurring. And these are some of the things that make prediction of ground motion so uncertain. Because if we're characterizing our path by a source-to-site distance, we could easily have two sources that are at the same source-to-site distance, but by traveling along different paths, we could have very different characteristics of earthquake ground motions. This is illustrated after the San Fernando, or after the Northridge earthquake, where there were some ground motions that were recorded, and there were a lot of questions about whether they were accurate or not. And so some seismologists went out to different locations in the San Fernando Valley and put out some instruments. And then they went a distance away and set off explosives. And the two sites that they set the explosives off were not that far apart. The angle at which these waves were coming from the explosive sources to the sites were differed by only 3.7 degrees. So they took the measured results, took away the effects of the shallow soils, and for the first blast that they set off, they referred to it as the pyramid shot, they had a distribution of ground motions that looked like this. When they did the second one, that differed only by 3.7 degrees, almost coming from exactly the same direction, what they recorded looked like this. So very significant differences in the amplitudes and significant differences in the spatial distributions. Even though the waves were coming from essentially the same direction or very similar directions. And so there are critical angles of refraction when waves hit boundaries between different materials. And the behavior of the waves that get transmitted across those boundaries can be very different depending on whether you're just to one side of that critical angle, just below that critical angle, or just above that critical angle. So these path effects are complicated, and these also lead to uncertainties in our abilities to predict earthquake ground motions. So they are complex. When we finally get to the site here, this may be a series of soil layers, or maybe there's some rock layers and soil layers, maybe tens of meters thick, maybe a couple hundred meters thick. We have to worry about site effects, amplification, de-amplification, and lengthening of the durations of the ground motions. And these are all things that we're concerned about. Questions are these things predictable? Can we predict the source effects? Can we predict path effects? Can we predict site effects? Really, our conclusion is at this point, we can't predict source effects because we don't know the characteristics of the source. We don't know where the strong spots are and where the weak spots are. We can figure these things out now after an earthquake has occurred, but that doesn't help us so much. Path effects, we generally don't know, but in areas that are heavily instrumented and are heavily studied by seismologists, we're starting to be able to determine that by recording many earthquakes, smaller earthquakes, even very small earthquakes. Seismologists can perform analyses where they build a model of the crust. This is done commonly in Southern California. There's a lot of earthquake research being done there. And by repeatedly back calculating the apparent stiffnesses of the materials in the Earth's crust through hundreds of earthquakes, they're starting to get a handle on what the crustal velocity structure looks like. And when another earthquake comes along, they take their current understanding of the crustal velocity structure and they try to predict what the ground motions in that new earthquake would have been. And they're doing better and better jobs. Then they take that information and use it to update their crustal velocity models. So at some point in the future, we may be able to do that, but we're not there yet. Site effects, though, we can do a pretty good job of predicting. We can do it based on empirical procedures, and we can do it based on numerical analyses. So we'll be talking about those. When we talk about site effects, we have to think about what the site really is. Where does the site begin and the path end? In some cases, it's quite simple. We may have a series of soil layers sitting on top of bedrock. And so our site begins at the top of the bedrock or the bottom of the soil deposit, and we can perform one-dimensional analyses. And we often do this. It's the most common type of analysis that we perform when we're predicting the site response. But if we step back and look at a little bit bigger picture, we may find that our soil deposit is sitting in some sort of a basin. A depression in the rock surface has been filled in with soil, and it may not be as appropriate to use a one-dimensional analysis. Maybe in the middle of a basin like this, it's okay, but over towards the edges, it may not be okay. If we step back a little more, we may see that things are different. But we can, for a situation like this, we can build a response model that consists of both rock and soil, and we can model this geometry of the rock surface and look at its effects on the site response. Our site now includes both soil and rock. If we're going to, the effect of the basin will be accounting for directly. We may find that rock that we saw at relatively shallow depths is underlain at greater depths by older, stiffer rock. So we may have a soil inside a rock basin that's inside another rock basin. And so things can become quite complicated. If we want to model this whole thing, we have to build a very large computational model. We're going to have our soil basin within the rock basin, but we can model the behavior of materials in this way. We can do it in 2 dimensions, or we can do it in 3 dimensions. If we have a situation where there is a basin and we do one-dimensional analyses, we're not going to be able to represent all the wave types that exist. The rated waves that I spoke about earlier introduce both vertical and horizontal ground motions, and we can't account for that in a typical one-dimensional analysis. So if we're going to attempt to use a 1D analysis, we should make sure that our basin, our input motions, has some of the effects that we see in basins. It's an approximation, however. We have to, if we're going to analyze the whole thing, we're going to have to build a numerical model. And these kinds of models can be require very heavy computational effort required, because you have many elements, many nodal points, and it can take a long time to run even on the fastest computers. Up where I live in Seattle, we have the Seattle Basin. It consists of a series of rock layers that are older and stiffer at the bottom, and become progressively softer as we move up to the surface, and eventually we have recent rock and we have glacial materials, and sometimes on top of the glacial materials we'll have post-glacial soils that are pretty soft and pretty loose. The Seattle Fault is at the southern end of the Seattle Basin, and so we have amplification of the ground motions that are associated with this basin, and it's typically long period or low frequency components of the ground motions that are most affected by the basin. And we're really just getting a handle on how to deal with these ground motions in the design process, even at this point. I was at a meeting just 4 or 5 weeks or so ago with the city of Seattle people trying to come up with a reasonable policy for how to handle what we're learning, the new information we're learning about the Seattle Basin. If we want to build a model of this, we're looking at 10 kilometers depth and 40 kilometers width just to get a handle on this particular problem. So site response analyses at these scales aren't performed very often, but they may become more practical in the future. So for site response, we're usually describing it relative to something. It could be relative to the response at some depth, relative to the response at bedrock, maybe at the bottom of the soil profile, or maybe a rock outcrop near our site. If we don't have any rock outcrops, we might look at response relative to what a ground motion prediction equation, a ground motion model would have predicted. So we do it in a relative sense, typically. We can express it in terms of ratios. We could use the peak of ground acceleration as our intensity measure of interest. We could look at ratios of peak ground accelerations. We could look at ratios of Fourier spectra, or we could look at ratios of response spectra to describe amplification or de-amplification effects. We can do it for individual motions, or we can take groups of motions and average their amplification behavior together. And we do these things. If we have extremely high levels of site response, which we may have with very, very strong ground motions, or maybe with very weak materials, we'll get some permanent deformations occurring. Then the question is whether we're really dealing with a site response problem or a ground response problem. It's not really a difference. One is sort of an extreme case of another. But extreme cases of site response can lead to ground failure and to pretty substantial problems. We know this site effects are important. We can do some theoretical exercises to show that they're important, but having actual evidence in the form of measurements and observations out in the field in reality are the evidence that we really need. It's really convincing. In the early years of geotechnical earthquake engineering, site effects weren't recognized. It wasn't thought that, or wasn't recognized that the shaking on soil was different than the shaking on rock. The shaking on sand was different than the shaking on clay, soft clay versus stiff clay. Everything was designed the same way. It wasn't until we started seeing some of these effects out in the field that even the building codes in the U.S. started to recognize and account for local soil conditions. It wasn't until the 1970s or so, the early 1970s, that these kinds of factors were accounted for in the codes. So Professor Bray talked about the 1967 Caracas earthquake previously. Here's a photo of Caracas. And the rock areas of East Caracas, not particularly strong shaking, 0.06 to 0.08 G, but there was a lot of damage to high-rise structures, a lot of people were killed, and there was a lot of damage. This is back in 1967. The thickness of clays in Caracas varies from none near the perimeter of the valley to over 300 meters. Contours are shown here. The symbols that you see represent the locations of damaged buildings with different heights. The squares are 6 to 9 stories, the stars are 10 to 12, and the triangles are buildings greater than 14 stories in height. If we look at a cross-section from north to south, looking to the west, it looks like this. There are different layers. So we have the basin effects with hard rock at the bottom and sedimentary rock overlain by soils that became softer as you moved up towards the ground surface. And the shear wave velocities are shown here to illustrate the changes in stiffness that exist there, the differences in stiffness. 3 to 5 story buildings, relatively short buildings, were damaged about 20 to 25% rate when they were underlain by about less than 70 meters or so of the soil at that location. 5 to 9 story buildings suffered relatively uniform rates of damage, about 10% all the way across the city. 10 to 14 story buildings suffered very little damage, maybe 10% were damaged when they were underlain by less than about 120 or 130 meters of soil. But when they were underlain by more than 200 meters of soil, about 3 times the rate of damage was experienced. And 14 story structures or better had little damage, maybe 10%, at depths when they were underlain by less than 130 meters or so of soil, but about 80% were damaged when they were underlain by the thicker soils, greater than about 200 meters or so. And so these aren't instrumental ground motion recordings, but it's very strong evidence that the soil conditions had an effect. Short buildings were damaged in shallow soil areas, and tall buildings were damaged in deep soil areas. It's hard to argue against this kind of evidence. So it's indirect, but very useful evidence of the importance of local soil conditions on ground motions. In San Francisco in 1957, there was a smaller earthquake, 5.3 magnitude, but there were instruments at different locations in the city. 3 of the instruments were at rock outcrops, places where rock was exposed at the ground surface. On the left side here, there was a valley that had been filled in with primarily sandy soils, and on the right side, another valley that had been filled in with more cohesive soils, and at this profile we have a deep layer with some very soft soils in it. If we look at the response spectra of the recorded motions for the stiff sites, the rock sites, they all look quite similar. They have their peak spectral accelerations at about 0.2 seconds or so, and at long periods, I'll say around 1 second or so, they're pretty weak. The spectral accelerations there were quite low. If we move to the site with the stiffer infill of the valley, the sandy soils, you can see that its peak is reached at maybe 0.25 seconds, a little bit longer period, but we can see that the spectral accelerations are quite a bit higher in the maybe 0.5 to 1 second range. So the characteristics of the ground motions were different there, at least in longer periods. When we look at the valley that's filled in with softer soils, you can see those response spectra are quite a bit different. The peak accelerations, that is the 0 period spectral accelerations, are a lot lower. The peak is lower, it's at about 0.3 seconds or so. But out here we can see out of 1 second, much stronger levels of shaking. So the nature of the response here is very different. Looking at the peak acceleration values, they're about the same at the steep rock sites and the stiffer soil profile site, but they're a lot lower in the valley with the softer soils. Now, if you thought that peak acceleration was the most important parameter, you would think you'd be better off being in those soft soils in that valley on the right side. But if you had say a 10-story building that had a natural period of 1 second, you'd have a much stronger level of shaking here on the soil profile than you would over here on the rock profile. And so it's important to recognize it's not just peak acceleration or not any one specific soil parameter that tells you everything you want to know about an earthquake ground motion and its potential to cause damage. Mexico City in 1985, Mexico City also an old lake, built on an old lake bed. There were 2 instruments, one at UNAM, National University, and one at a communications building located out on the old lake bed, underlain by about 30 meters of soft clay. The UNAM site was underlain by rock-like materials. The magnitude 8.1 earthquake, a subduction zone earthquake, a large distance away, over 200 miles. The ground motions that were recorded at these 2 sites looked like this. They're the same distance away from the source, effectively. It's the same magnitude because it was the same earthquake, but we had ground motions at the rock site of about 0.03 G and 5 times greater on the soft soil site. And in that region, there was a lot of damage to structures. So our soft clay here amplified the bedrock motions by about a factor of 5. In the Loma Prieta earthquake in San Francisco, the earthquake occurred down to the south of San Francisco Bay, which is shown here. The city of San Francisco is out around here. Oakland is here. The Oakland Bay Bridge connects the two, and there's an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay called Yerba Buena Island. It's a rock outcrop. And next to it is Treasure Island. Treasure Island is a man-made island that was made for a 1939 exposition that took place. And so it has hydraulic fills on top of some soft clay sediments that were on the bottom of San Francisco Bay. The same distance essentially from the earthquake, and the motions that were recorded at the accelerometers on the 2 sites look like this. Yerba Buena Island, peak acceleration of about 0.06 G, and Treasure Island about 2.5 times larger than that. The response spectra is shown on the right. Very different. Treasure Island had spectral accelerations that were much higher than those in Yerba Buena Island. So same magnitude earthquake, same distance, the difference in the local soil conditions. So here we have instrumental evidence of the importance of local soil conditions on site response. So soft soil, you can experience very different motions than on rock. We can measure these effects most accurately by means of vertical arrays, where we have instruments placed on the ground surface and instruments below the ground surface. So this is the Garner Valley array in Southern California, where there are accelerometers at the ground surface at depths of 6, 15, 22, 50, 220, and 500 meters. So the instruments, I don't know if you can make it out very well, but there are kind of stakes sticking up out of the ground that show the locations of these instruments. This is a test structure that's also instrumented to try to measure its response during an earthquake. They put pore pressure transducers down below the water table at this site at 4 different depths to measure pore pressures during strong earthquake shaking. The Loteng array in Taiwan was constructed quite a long time ago. It includes a free field array that is at a significant distance, 46 meters, from a quarter-scale nuclear reactor building. It also has an array, a downhole array next to it. And it has recorded some earthquakes. The The soil profile is shown here with standard penetration test flow counts showing softer soils underlain by stiffer soils. And in different ground motions, you can see at depths of 17 meters, 11 meters, 6 meters, and at the ground surface, you can see the nature of the shaking. And we can see that as the earthquake waves have gone from large depths up to shallower depths, where the materials are softer, the amplitude increases. And the highest amplitudes are at the ground surface, and all of these events as we move downward, we see the motions are not as strong. So this is a characteristic that we very commonly see in vertical arrays. There's an important vertical array in Southern California, at least important for people who are interested in soil liquefaction. It's at a place called Wildlife, and at Wildlife there's a liquefiable silty sand that's saturated at depths of about 2.5 to 7 meters or so, and there's a strong motion instrument right below that liquefiable layer and another one above the liquefiable layer. There are also a series of pore pressure transducers installed there. We'll talk more about this case later. We don't think that the pore pressure transducers worked properly there, but it's an invaluable case history because we have recordings of ground motions that were affected by liquefaction, and we know what the shaking was right below it and right above it. When this was installed, a magnitude 6.2 earthquake occurred. It's called the Elmore Ranch earthquake, and it wasn't strong enough to trigger liquefaction. And so we see in the early stages, here this is the downhole instrument that was below the liquefiable layer, that silty layer. Here's the surface instrument. You can see the surface motion is stronger than the downhole motion. We can see a lot of high frequencies all the way through this record. The next day, the Superstition Hills earthquake occurred, and it was a magnitude 6.6, so the shaking was stronger, and it lasted a little bit longer, and these are the motions that were recorded. Again, the bottom part is in the downhole instrument, and the upper part shows the ground surface motion. And we can see high-frequency motions occurring here all the way up to about 14 seconds, and then things change. The amplitude of the accelerations decreases, the higher frequencies go away, and we see mostly low-frequency response occurring after that. This is liquefaction, and we believe that liquefaction was triggered right around the 14-second mark or so. So when we talk about amplification, we can talk about surface to downhole amplification. We can look at ratios of the surface to downhole instrument if we have a vertical array. Often we'll look at ratios of surface instruments on soil to surface instruments at rock outcrops. It can also be informative, and we'll take their ratios as amplification factors. The rock motion serves as a reference motion for us. And we can use any kind of intensity measure we want. Peak acceleration, spectral acceleration, Fourier amplitude, peak velocity. There's a whole bunch of choices. If we don't have rock instruments available, we may use a GMPE as our reference intensity measure. We can use peak parameters, we can use Fourier parameters, we can use response spectral parameters. Peak parameters, like peak acceleration, the one we most commonly use, generally tells us something about the amplitude of high-frequency components of a ground motion. So we can look at, say, the El Centro record and find its peak acceleration value. We can look at ratios of Fourier spectra, and so they are shown here. Sometimes Fourier spectra have jagged shapes, so sometimes we need to smooth them before we take ratios. But anything that has a ratio above 1 implies that that frequency is being amplified, and below 1 is being de-amplified. So we use Fourier spectra to talk about the frequency content of a motion. We look at time histories of acceleration, and we'll see how the acceleration amplitude varies with time. The Fourier spectrum lets us see how it varies with frequency. And that's important because the systems we care about are sensitive to frequency. They respond differently at different frequencies. So we can see here the frequencies at which amplification occurs and which de-amplification occurs. We can do the same thing with response spectra, and now we're looking at the ground motion through the filter of a single degree of freedom system, and we're just looking at the peak response. But nevertheless, we can look at ratios of response spectra and see the periods at which spectral accelerations are being amplified and being de-amplified. And we can see here that the lower periods, which would be higher frequencies, are being de-amplified, and the longer periods, or lower frequencies, are being amplified by this suite of motions. So we're not seeing the amplification of the ground motion itself when we look at response spectra, but we're seeing how spectral ordinates are amplified. So side effects clearly play a very important role in controlling amplitude, frequency content, and will also affect durations of earthquake and ground motions, as we'll talk about later. We didn't recognize them for a long time, but now we understand how important they are in the U.S. and everywhere, including here. We've been able to quantify this behavior by seismic instrumentation, and as our amount of seismic instrumentation data has increased, we've been able to do this better. Vertical arrays are very, very useful for understanding the way a particular site is going to behave. Wildlife arrays have been very, very useful for understanding liquefiable soil behavior. And those of us interested in liquefaction are trying to get more vertical arrays installed in liquefiable soil. So we put one in recently in Seattle that will be very nice when we get an earthquake that generates pore pressure at some point in the future. Unfortunately, installing instrumentation is usually a good way to stop earthquakes from occurring. So we'll have to wait and see how that works out. Okay, I think we're scheduled for a break now, and we are closer to being on schedule. When are we coming back?
16:10.
16:10. Okay, so you're break, and we'll come back and talk some more. Thank you.